Hi, welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Let's go to Tennessee and talk with Catherine Austin Fitts, who served in the George H.W. Bush administration. Catherine is also a former banker and is now an investment advisor and blogger at Solari.com. Catherine Fitts, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Max, it's great to be back.
All right, Catherine Austin Fitts. First, Matt Taibbi, in the latest Rolling Stone, asks, is the SEC covering up Wall Street crimes? Your thoughts?
Yes, because the economic model is a criminal model. So, of course, they're covering up crimes. They have to.
Okay, so when you say the economic model is a criminal model, explore that a little bit. In other words, the banking system itself is basically a glorified Ponzi scheme, correct?
Well, we have an economy that's dependent on war and organized crime, and part of the profits of that organized crime is part of what's keeping the whole economy going. It's not just the banking system, it's every community in America. So let me give it this way. If the United Nations says we're competing for $400 billion a year of global money laundering, then the financial centers who attract that money laundering are the leaders.
Okay, let me follow up on this money laundering theme because Wachovia, now owned by Wells Fargo, which is owned in large part by Warren Buffett, has just been fined 2% of 1 year's profits for laundering $378 billion in drug money for the Mexican drug cartels. What about this settlement? Is it an adequate deterrent, first of all?
No, absolutely not. If your business model is dependent on attracting those revenues and processing those revenues, there's no way a fine like this can be a deterrent. If something, if something is part of what I do, an essential part of the business model, a fine like this won't stop it.
Okay, let's talk about the proportion of these banks. First of all, the banks in the U.S. and in the U.K., because I want to kind of talk about the U.K. a little bit. The GDP numbers that are quoted in both of these economies as the relationship to what comes out of the banking sector, it has grown fantastically over the past 25 years and over the past 10 years in particular, from 5 or 6% 25 years ago to 25, 30, 40, depending on how you make the calculation, 50, 60% of GDP directly tied to financial legerdemain in the banking system. So is it fair to say that the GDP numbers that come out of the U.S. and the UK are tied directly to banking fraud?
Well, I think they're tied. They include banking fraud, but they include sort of the securitization of the economy. So we're shifting much more of the economy into financial instruments that can be traded and represented. And there's no doubt that the fraud is very significant. And part of the reason it's very significant is that a lot of the fraud is done with the intimate support and involvement of government. So you really have a government banking model, and a lot of it is done under the national security law.
Okay, you talk about securitization. More and more of the economy moves into securitization. More corporations who are reporting profits as a result of transferring themselves into companies that get into the securitization business. But let's take an example for Goldman Sachs, for example, in the mortgage business. We now know that the mortgages, when they were originally offered, there was fraudulent inducement. Then we know that they took the mortgages that they sold, they repackaged them or securitized them and fraudulently marketed them to funds around the world. And then we know that they went into the foreclosure process, and Goldman and Bank of America and these other corporations and banks engage in fraudulent foreclosures. So if you take away all the fraud associated with securitization, and securitization itself is now proven to be an inherently fraudulent business. I mean, the word, okay, first of all, so what's your thought on that?
Well, I think it's much worse than you're describing, Max, because you described the original mortgages were fraudulently induced. Let me use an example of one house. Let's say we had a fraudulently induced mortgage on that house, but let's say we also created 10 mortgages that were completely fraudulent. So I think the collateral fraud, if you take the description you described and you add collateral fraud, I think it was much worse. And then when you layer the derivatives on top of something that's full of collateral fraud, you're getting sort of exponential fraud. So I think the fundamental fraud process was far worse than you just described.
Right. So you have, on top of the three phases of fraud that I just described, the fraudulent inducement, fraudulent securitization, and of course the fraudulent placement of those securities into funds around the world. You also have the derivatives that were created on top of the fraudulent securities on top of that. So that adds to the Ponzi scheme. I mean, we keep coming back to this word technically legal. It's technically legal. But in a country like America or the UK, where the banking lobby has effectively taken over and changed the laws, repealed Glass-Steagall, brought in the Securities Modernization Act, and made fraud legal. I mean, if you make fraud legal, is it enough to say, well, it's technically legal? I mean, at what point do we say enough is enough, we need to take stronger measures?
Well, I think at the heart of the matter, Max, is not sort of banks out of control. I think at the heart of the matter is physical violence. Because a lot of what has happened, particularly that I understand in the United States, is you have people who are afraid to say no because the result of saying no is physical violence directed at them or their families. I mean, we've had lots of people murdered and assassinated, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, yes, we have to say no, but the question is, how do we say no? And that's why it comes down to shifting our money. But the reality is we have a force operating in the world that is completely operating outside of the law, and no one yet has come up with a way to stop it. We're talking about violent mobster operations.
So give us an example.
I hate to use a personal example, but I was a former assistant secretary of housing, and I had my own business in Washington, and I was helping the Department of Housing and Urban Development essentially run things clean, and you had to get rid of the clean team to run the housing bubble. And I was targeted, I was poisoned, I had dead animals left on my doorstep, my house was broken into, people tried to run me off the road. It was very, very violent, and it went on for years. So people who try and run the government clean or run Wall Street clean are targeted and literally, have to fear for their lives. I mean, people have been dying. So, it's a very, very dangerous situation. And the challenge is, if you have people who can kill and physically harass with impunity, how do you run a governance process?
Just for people who are unfamiliar, your role with the Bush Senior administration was what exactly?
I was Assistant Secretary of Housing, so I was the lead regulator for the housing area. And it's very interesting, Max, because I left Washington in 1998, and I kept saying to people, look, they're engineering a housing bubble. This is going to destroy the country. It's going to bankrupt the country. And literally, I'll never forget it, in about 2000, 2001, the Soprano TV show had a whole series on HUD fraud. And my old college roommate called me up and said, wow, Fitz, you must be telling the truth. It's on The Sopranos. And I said, why is it that the Soprano TV show is more credible than the former Assistant Secretary of Housing? But literally, Max, I lectured and spoke in London, in Wellington, New Zealand, all over the world, in Sweden, trying to warn people about the housing bubble, and the investment community in all those places simply just ignored it. I mean, when Fannie Mae went down in 2008, I had been on the radio show in outside of San Francisco explaining about the housing bubble, for years. And one of the biggest investors in San Francisco lost over $1 billion on Fannie Mae going down, and wrote up a thing on their website and put it up and said, we had no idea there was a problem. Well, I was on the radio for years, the former Assistant Secretary of Housing, saying, describing the problem in great detail.
Okay, you mentioned Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. They were caught committing fraud. They were bailed out by the government. Their liabilities are now the taxpayers' liabilities. We've talked about Wachovia. We've talked about Wells Fargo. We talked about Bank of America. All the banks committing massive fraud, securities fraud, accounting fraud. What role in the global accounting and securities fraud that you see in the banks, how central does the City of London factor into this?
Max, clearly the City of London is very important. And I would say in the United States that European investment interests have been controlling since the Revolutionary War, from everything I can tell. But, the other thing I would say is we're talking about a model which is not just fraud. It is the model. It's the plan. It's the governance model. It's the way things are. So there's the official reality that has law, as you and I were brought up to believe it. And then we have a system which believes it's above the law. I mean, I literally had the Secretary of HUD once say to me, look, I don't have to pay attention to the law. I don't have to obey the law. I report to a higher moral authority. So we have the planet run under a model that's operating under a different set of rules and laws that we believe the law to be. Now, if you look at how much money's been pulled out of the economy globally, whether it's by United States, London, whatever, we're talking about trillions of dollars. And, I refer to a lot of it in the United States as the black budget. But the fundamental question is, where is all this money going? Because we're talking about trillions and trillions of dollars that have been pulled out and managed according to I call it a financial coup d'etat. But the question is, who's running the financial coup d'etat and where's all the money going? Because it's very, very significant, and it's a system that doesn't consider itself to have to obey the laws that you and I are talking about now.
Hey, let me ask you a question about the European debt crisis. French President Sarkozy and German Chancellor Merkel have proposed a, quote, collective government headed by an EU president. Your thoughts? So
what we're watching is the economic failure of centralization. The more you centralize, the weaker the economy's going to get. So what they just said is centralization has just wrecked Europe. So what we're going to do is we're going to do more centralization. Well, of course, that's the worst thing you can do. So, I hate to say this because I don't think Europe has a debt crisis. I think Europe's governance is being re-engineered and debt is being used to do it. So we go into a place, we encourage them to take on more debt than they can ever afford. Then we do a series of things that pull the income. Then we say we have a debt crisis, and then we start dictating to them terms by which they will stop being run as a sovereign government and instead report up to the top of the financial system. So that's why I call it a financial coup d'etat, because it's not a debt crisis, it's a plan.
All right, Catherine Austin Fitts, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.